My favorite US commentator, as you all very well know, is the one and only Garland Nixon, radio talk show host, political analyst, who joins us now. Garland, welcome back. Always a pleasure to see you. Let's start with the Epstein affair. Who'll be the next person to commit suicide?
Well, one thing for sure, we know it won't be any of the perpetrators of the crimes. Those, we don't know who they are, and those are the only people that don't seem to commit suicide. We know that Mark Middleton, who was the gentleman, the friend of and associate of Bill Clinton, who let Epstein into the White House 17 times. He was later found in Arkansas, hanging from a tree with a gunshot wound to his neck. To his chest. And according to the New York Post, there was no gun found in the area. That was a very difficult suicide. We know Jeffrey Epstein, a man who was placed, and most people don't know this, he was placed in a cell. His cellmate was a man named Nicholas Tartaglione, who was a mob hitman who was later convicted of strangling a man to death and shooting the man that he killed had 4 associates. He shot all of them in the back of the head. This was Epstein's cellmate, and we're supposed to believe that Epstein committed suicide. We know Bill Clinton has not committed suicide. Prince Andrew has not committed suicide. And all the victims, we don't know because apparently we'll never know who they are.
What's the justification for not yet having published a single name on Epstein's client list?
Well, apparently it was just that was campaign rhetoric. It was made to sound good. Trump sounded like he was the anti-establishment person, and he was going to let out all of the information that we'd never found before. The reality is that I think those of us who thought we would, well, I'll put it like this. There were people that thought we may get information on RFK and JFK, but when it came to Epstein, the people who committed the crimes are all mostly probably still alive, still very powerful figures. So I think it's a bit naive of us to even have thought that Donald Trump could do that, or he'd probably commit suicide in the White House and hang himself if he tried it.
Well, very succinctly put. I called him Tony Soprano, but on a very loud and vulgar day at the Pope's funeral the other day. But one of the things that he did do that I commend, he gave little Macron a humiliating dressing down when Macron tried to gate crash his tete-a-tete with little Zelensky, who was dressed even more inappropriately than President Trump. What do you think the two were saying to each other?
Well, the bottom line, and I've said this for a while, is I think it doesn't really matter what Donald Trump says. We have to judge by his actions because he's big on over-the-top rhetoric. He is, traditionally an entertainer, so he loves to get out in public, give the appearance of dressing down someone, arguing with someone, making a lot of noise. But when he comes back, one day he says, we're so close to a deal with the Russians. The next day he says, they are doing bad things and we're going to have to go to massive sanctions. So we just seem to be treading water, doing the same thing over and over. The other thing I'll say about Donald Trump's dress and acts of decency, or the lack thereof, at the funeral. You just told a story about a country, the United States, through its proxy, Israel, that's slaughtering people. Men, women, and children, starving people to death. I think it would be unreasonable for us to even expect any level of decency from the leader of a country that would do those kinds of things. Donald Trump should have came in dressed like Dracula with blood all over his suit. That would have been more appropriate for the leader of the United States and Israel at this point. It would be more accurate and appropriate, I think.
It has taken the darkest turn in the sense that not only is there a daily attrition, more than half of the victims being women and children, but mass starvation. It's plausible, because we've had 18 months to observe it, that people are not moved by bombings of buildings, because the argument always is, well, the terrorists are hiding in there. But that argument cannot be adduced when you are boasting that you are literally starving people to death in complete defiance of all international law. So they just actually pretend that it isn't happening.
Well, and I think the last part that you said is important, the part about international law. We can talk about the morality of what's going on. Certainly, we can talk about the horrible things that are happening, but the reality is there's international law here. These violations are violations of international law. And I think, the people will defend the Israelis, whether they have a, quote, right to defend themselves or, whether Hamas is in a building. But the bottom line is these things are all covered by international law. And the United States and the Europeans will say we're sailing through the Taiwan Straits because international law says we have freedom of navigation, and they will flout international law when it benefits them and completely ignore the daily violations, the arrogant rhetoric that we get from the Israelis that make it clear that they intend to violate international law, and that they really feel as though international law doesn't apply to them because they have the United States there to protect them. So, what we're dealing with is massive violations of international law, and this is an indictment on the international institutions that are supposed to keep this international law, because they'll put out a warrant for President Putin for a claim that doesn't even have a plaintiff, but yet they can't figure out that slaughtering men and women and children and starving people to death is not a violation of the laws that are written right in front of their faces.
What about the great tariff war? That's another Trump failure, isn't it? He started out saying this would bring China to its knees. Then he said China would be bound to call him. Then he asked China to call him. And now he's claiming that the two are speaking on the phone when the Chinese flat out deny it. They say there are no negotiations going on, and there will be none as long as Trump is sticking to these tariffs against China. Help us through this labyrinth, Garland.
Well, there are a number of suspicions here. One of them that I have is this was effectively the Nord Streaming of American people, in the same way that they blew up the German pipeline, knowing that it was going to have a negative effect on the German people and the people of Europe, but with completely disregard for the working class and their lives. They're taking these actions, and I think one could argue that either they were decoupling from China, planning for a war on China, so we've got to decouple first, or that they felt that there could be some combination of both, or that they felt that they could take action that would cripple China's economy. But either way, it's the same thing: a complete reckless disregard for the everyday lives and the economic needs for the working class of America. But I think it backfired. I do believe that it has presented an opportunity for China, to be quite honest. I think China knows the United States is saying we want to go to war with China by 2027 or 2029, whatever year it is. It gives the Chinese an opportunity to stop selling the United States the magnets and the various things that our military-industrial complex needs to build the weapons to attack China. I would suspect that when there is some level of an economic resolution to this, that China's still going to say, we're not selling you the stuff to build bombs and missiles because you're telling us that you're going to attack us with those bombs and missiles. I would also think that China may say, look, we're both have some pain here. You need a resolution. How about this? Stay the heck out of Taiwan and we'll give you the resolution. Because what does China do? What does Trump do if China says that's where we draw the line? You got to stay out of Taiwan and stop sending them missiles. I think the U.S. would be in a bad situation because the neocons wouldn't let Trump say yes. But if he didn't, our economy would get wiped out.
Now, the domestic political situation, we now know, I think I asked you before, if Joe Biden was still alive. Well, we know he's barely alive, but alive enough to eat spaghetti in a Rome bistro, although God knows the mess he made down the front of his shirt. But he is still alive, but is he nominally still the leader of the U.S. Democrats? Who's calling the shots? Who's the opposition in the United States?
The Democratic Party is not really an opposition. They are an opposition to Donald Trump. but not in opposition to Donald Trump's policies. They'll say we hate Donald Trump and he's terrible and Elon Musk is evil, but when you ask them about about his foreign policy, the only anger they have at him is that he's not hawkish enough. And if you look at his, they push back a little bit when it comes to the China tariffs, but again, they're so anti-China that they're not going to push back even on that. We do have these fake protests coming out, and these anti-Trump protests, and they're fake because the people who are setting up these protests are on the mainstream media all constantly talking about the protests. These protests are pushed by the mainstream media. There's another one on May 1st. And might I add, the people that set up the last protest, the two people the indivisible.org that set up the last protest that Nancy Pelosi attended, one of them was a former State Department advisor. The other one was a former Obama advisor who ran an NGO that was funded by BlackRock. So now we've got the BlackRock State Department resistance that are setting up protests around the country. So now, one thing about these protests, there's no anti-war element to them. The only thing they addressed when it came to war was they had a sign up that said hands off NATO. So that's the opposition to Donald Trump, is the hands off NATO protesters.
You couldn't make it up. Finally, and I'm always grateful for your time, Garland, it's good news that there's not much in the news about the Iran talks. They were in Oman, they moved to Rome. Heaven knows where they are now, but the fact is they're still going on. Are you confident that there won't be a US-Iran war?
Yes, I am. I believe that it was a bluff. If you look at the three places where the U.S. is negotiating, they're all the same negotiation. In Iran, in Russia, in China, in all three places, the United States is playing as though they have a strong hand against China. The United States is folding their hand because we cannot maintain these tariffs. Against Russia, the United States, Trump even admits Russia's going to win the war. Russia doesn't need a resolution to this. We do. We need to get out of it. In Iran, I do not believe that the United States can defeat Iran in the way that they'd like to defeat Iran. They can't. They can do. Could they win? Possibly. I don't know what you define win, but they take a terrible bloody nose, and theoretically, our entire economy could be wiped out. So it's too big a risk for Donald Trump. So in all of the negotiations, the United States is not the world hegemon, doesn't have the military or economic power that it once had, but it's trying to negotiate as though it does, which means it's going to lose all of them.
Garland, how does one find your material now that they have locked you out of Twitter, or have you got back in? I tagged you earlier and it did go through, but as I understand it, the last time we talked, you can't even open your Twitter.
Oh, no. They according to Twitter, they can't figure out who owns the account that I've had since 2009. So they're completely, but they are nice enough to accept my payment. So I continue to pay them. That is, in fact, it keeps the statute of limitations over, because every time they take another payment from me, that's another incident of breach of contract. But the bottom line is, people can find me. I'm on Facebook, I'm on Telegram, and I have a YouTube, Rumble, and Rockfin show. So I'm on there daily having fun, and I have a lot of great guests.